Hi, friends, and welcome to the 1840 podcast, where each month we explore a different topic balancing modern sensibilities with traditional sensitivities to give you new approaches to timeless Jewish ideas. I'm your host, David Beshefkin, and this month we're continuing our exploration of the world of Chabad and the Lubavitcher Rebbe. This podcast is part of a larger exploration of those big, juicy Jewish ideas. So be sure to check out 1840.org, where you can also find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly emails. I don't usually begin talking about this. I don't even notice it. I'm not actually the person who generally picks out the names, the titles for each individual podcast. But I wanted to begin by talking about the title for this podcast, which is, I believe we settled on, Is the Rebbe Moshiach? Now, from the outset, I want to obviously state this is very much a gimmick. This isn't the tone of the entire conversation. And there is something kind of sensational and almost salacious. It's like clickbait that we would entitle a podcast, Is the Rebbe Moshiach? As if, at the end of this, we're going to come out with a clear answer, as if we're advocating like, yeah, maybe he is, maybe he isn't. We're taking a side. The honest truth is I wouldn't say I don't care, but the point of this question of why we titled this podcast is not because it is a description of the conversation. First and foremost, I have to be honest, there's a gimmick component to it. I know for sure the guest today, who is my dearest friend, mentor, I consider him really a chaver and a Rebbe of the highest order, and that is my friend Eli Rubin, a Chabad Hasid who writes for Chabad.org. He has a forthcoming book being published by Stanford University Press on the idea, I think it's Stanford University, and on the idea of Tzimtzum, God's divine constriction. It is absolutely fascinating, and his book really discusses how this idea is carried out and discussed in the world of Chabad, forthcoming very, very soon. The title is a forthcoming book. I don't think it's out yet. It's called Kabbalah and the Rupture of Modernity, an Existential History of Chabad Hasidism. He also was involved, along with Philip Wexler and his son, a different book called Social Vision, which is about the Rebbe's approach to social services and really his mystical approach to social ideas. I'm bringing this up because I could say definitively, I know this for an absolute fact, Eli Rubin did not want our conversation to be titled, Is the Rebbe Moshiach? I mean, come on now. He doesn't want to step into that. It's very gimmicky. It's not his style. Why did I insist upon it? Really for two reasons. One is the gimmick, is the clickbait, is okay, let's get into it. But really there's a much more important reason. And the second reason is really what I have learned from Eli Rubin, from his writings, which is learning how to take theological questions seriously. Very often we have a discomfort in talking theology. Theology, I'm trying not to use Torah words even, like sometimes we'll call it machshava, sometimes we'll call it Kabbalah. Machshava is like Jewish thought, or machshavas Yisroel. I don't like any of those titles. I actually like the title theology. I like theology because it is a discipline that is coming to ask the most cosmic questions about existence, about the world, about how God interacts and is manifest in this world, assuming there is a God. And the reason why I wanted to title something like Is the Rebbe Moshiach is because questions like that we usually demote or we put into the box of politics or, social questions, or even like hashkafa, which is like your contemporary religious outlook. I'm a little bit more right-wing. I'm a little bit more left-wing. And so much of the way in which we filter the world is through a political lens. I have no problem with that. I find politics interesting to a degree, but only as interesting as I think politics is an applied manifestation of a much deeper, more essential worldview that rests on different theological outlooks of how the world works. This is the foundation of all thought. Philosophy, economics, psychology really comes down to fundamental and essential questions of how do you think this world functions? And the person who really opened my eyes to showing me what does it mean to take theology seriously? What does it mean not to throw around buzzwords, not to quote little Vartlach, little short Chassidic ideas, which are uplifting and inspirational, but aren't necessarily getting to the essential questions about existence. And what Eli Rubin taught me, and what is so much this conversation is about, is we don't need to be, I don't want to use the word afraid. We don't need to approach theology as something that is silly, that you kind of like wave your hand and say, okay, come on now, let's get to the real stuff. I believe this is the real stuff. This is the most foundational, essential questions about existence itself. I have a dear friend named Penny. I know he's not going to mind if I quote him on this, but I'm not going to use his last name, but you'll figure it out who it is. And Penny used to sit right next to me in the back when we would listen to my mentor and teacher, Rav Ari Bergman, when he would give classes in Sharei Tefillah, in the shul that I grew up in. And he loved Ari's explorations of Lumdus, of the Talmudic analysis, which is what we call Lumdus, which is the different Talmudic back and forth. He would love the halachic analysis. But anytime they started getting into more supernal, transcendent matters, he would call it Huey. He was like, it's Huey, I don't know. He would kind of shrug it off. And I don't criticize him for it. He knows how much I love him and admire him, and as does Ari, but it wasn't his speed. And I think very often that feeling we have is like, come on now, what does this have to do with anything? Let's get back to reality of our lives. The question that Rav Aaron Lopiansky asked in one of his essays that I actually quoted, an essay of mine called Jewish Thought, a Process, Not a Text. And I begin the article with the question that Rav Aaron Lopiansky asked, which is, okay, if you study these essential theological questions, at the end of the day, does it help improve your mincha? And I objected, obviously with great deference and respect, but I think this is, in a way, it does improve your mincha, your afternoon services and the way that you pray. But even more than that, it gives context and framing for what mincha is. What are we doing when we daven mincha? What are we doing when we don't feel like davening mincha? What are we doing for people who don't know what the word mincha even means? Why are they around? What's their purpose for the Jewish people, for the world? We need to start asking bigger theological questions. When you ask small questions, you get small answers. And I find very often people go through life and their questions are smaller. Which synagogue should I belong to? Even which community should I belong to? And you ask a smaller question, and that's, it's okay. You'll get a smaller answer. It's an answer that does not encompass and address the totality of existence and the world. It doesn't address world religions and everybody else. And you kind of have to live your life. Okay, I have this truth, and the rest of the world is mistaken or doesn't have it yet. Or, maybe we'll do outreach and they'll all come back and join, my synagogue and my community and my shul. To me, that is a small approach to reality. The vastness of the world, the vastness of human existence, of human history, is so much bigger than 2024. It's so much bigger than the little corner that most people, the 10 blocks that people interact with in their day-to-day lives. And we can usually get through our lives by asking smaller or more manageable or more practical questions. But I think this moment in 2024, when the world literally seems to be on the cusp of just existential doubt. We don't know why we're here. We don't know what we're fighting about, but we know that we're fighting. It is time to reintroduce cosmic theological questions and be able to ask them with maturity, sophistication, and seriousness, and not dismiss and say, okay, this is for the, for people who are meditating all day in some mountain. This is for the mystics. This is for all of us. We are all confronting the reality of existence. We are all confronting the same question that existence in and of itself asks of ourselves, which is, what is the purpose of all of this? And I know that's a cosmic question. I know that's something that's associated with, a 10th grader who, maybe smoked a little too much marijuana and is coming up at some party and is like, hey man, like, I don't think we should associate these questions, cosmic theological questions, with immaturity, with being overly idealistic. It just means that you are no longer satisfied distracting yourself by so many of the other distractions that we have that take our focus away from the most essential existential questions of existence, and that is big theological questions. And that is why I am so indebted and so excited for our conversation today with my dearest friend, Eli Rubin, because Eli Rubin asks those questions, he approaches reality with that seriousness, and he approaches other people's questions. Eli is not locked in. He's one of those fascinating people that I know. He is not stuck in one lane. He's reading all sorts of philosophy and academic works, but he is so deeply rooted in the approach of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, which is why I think he's the perfect person to close this series and introduce really the depth through the eyes of an insider of the thought and approach of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Reb Menachem Mendel Schneerson. It is my absolute privilege and pleasure to introduce our conversation with Eli Rubin. It really is such a privilege to be speaking with somebody who I really now consider a friend and a mentor, Rev. Eli Rubin. Thank you so much for coming back. This is your second interview on 1840, and thank you so much for joining us today.
It's really great to be here again.
So I want to begin with a question. We're here to talk about the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And I have been criticized very often by listeners of 1840 that I focus too much on superficialities. But, I think with the Rebbe, even superficialities had importance. So I want to begin with a little bit of a strange question, but I think it's actually something very important, at least to me, in understanding the Rebbe. And that is the Rebbe's father-in-law, who had a huge influence, obviously, on the Rebbe's life, who's known as the Rebbe Rayatz, I believe, the sixth Rebbe of Chabad, was the Rebbe's father-in-law. When he came to America, he famously said, America is nicht anders. America is going to be no different. We're going to build here too. And yet, when the Rebbe took over the Hasidus a year after the passing of his father-in-law, he did do things a little bit differently. He did respond to issues in America that seemed to be different challenges and different opportunities. The most superficial, and I'm beginning with the most superficial question, is that the Rebbe, as opposed to every other Hasidic Rebbe, did not wear a shtreimel. The Rebbe wore a hat. And I am wondering, I know I want you to answer the specific question about that switch, but I know it's superficial. And I want to know, do you think, or did the Rebbe ever discuss, was this part of something larger in adapting or interpreting or translating the legacy of Chabad onto American soil?
It's a very fascinating question, and I hear the point you're making about superficiality, but I think that you're right that it is a deep question. And I think that to answer it, you first have to ask the question, what is Hasidus? Because if you want to ask, did Hasidism adapt? You have to know what Hasidism is to begin with. And often we have this picture of some kind of ideal Hasidic past, and that was the true Hasidism. And either we're just trying to hang on to that authentic past and not let it fade away, or we're adapting away from it. And I think that's a massive misconception about, which depends on a superficial understanding of what Hasidism is. And what Hasidism really is, if we go back to the Baal Shem Tov, and all the more so in the case of Chabad, it's about communication. It's about relationships. And the most important relationship is the relationship between God and the world. So in all relationships, you need good communication. Otherwise, the relationship is going to fray. And the Baal Shem Tov said that he wants to bring connection. And in his famous letter that he wrote to Reb Gershon of Kittov, which is the founding document, as it were, of Hasidism.
Sure. His brother-in-law, I believe.
To his brother-in-law, exactly. And it's one of the only documents that everybody agrees today, all scholars, that this is an authentic letter authored by the Baal Shem Tov himself, whereas almost all the other teachings of the Baal Shem Tov were written down later by students or students of students. This is something that we know comes from the Baal Shem Tov's own hand. And there, in addition to the famous remark about the coming of moshiach being dependent on the spreading of the wellsprings of Hasidism, there's another very important remark that he makes there, which is that in every word that a person says, he should be uniting worlds and souls. And that unification, that bringing together of divinity, worlds, and souls, right? So that unification, that bonding, that creating of a relationship between the divine, between the worlds, between existence and souls, individuals, that's at the core of Hasidism. And I think the contribution of Chabad, Naftali Lowenthal, one of my own teachers, wrote a book, Communicating the Infinite, in which he made this very strong argument, which I think is absolutely correct, that the defining feature of Chabad Hasidism was to communicate the infinite. That is, that God should not just be some kind of abstract being, some kind of theological abstraction, or even just a more simplistic faith in some transcendent being, but rather that there should be a real communication, that God should be able to speak, be made to speak, as it were, be articulated. The divine should be articulated in words that we can understand and which we can implement in our lives, in the world. Right? The souls can implement divinity within the world. So when you look at it on that essential level of what Hasidism is, I don't think the Rebbe adapted Hasidism at all. I think that what the Rebbe did was he took the essence of what Hasidism always was, and he communicated divinity in the world that he found himself in. Now, everyone knows that all relationships are different. If the circumstances are different, you've got to communicate differently. If the audience is different, you've got to communicate differently. But what's important is not the language in which you're communicating. What's important is the content that you're communicating. And so I think on that essential level, there is no fundamental change. On the contrary, the Rebbe was someone, Elliot Wilson actually described this in a beautiful way in the introduction to Open Secret, which I know you've recently been reading. He says something to the effect that the Rebbe almost contributed nothing of his own. And the way the Rebbe presented himself was that he was contributing nothing new of his own, even though we who are students of the Rebbe know that he was a tremendous innovator in all kinds of ways, and that there were many new things that he contributed. But in a very deep sense, he was like the mystical attribute of God known as Malchus, which is described as a receptacle for all the other qualities of God. And so similarly, the Rebbe, this is how Elliot Wilson describes it. The Rebbe was a receptacle in which there was nothing of himself, and all that his being was a tremendous spilling over of the wellsprings of all who had come before him.
I hate to interrupt, and I hate to kind of bring it down to the superficiality, but I know you understand where I'm coming from, and I'm curious if the Rebbe addressed it or if any Hasidim speculated. Why did the Rebbe not wear typical Rebbish clothes? He did not wear a frock, as far a like a bekisha. He wore a long coat, I believe, but did not wear the shiny bekisha that nearly every other Hasidus wears, and his own father-in-law. And he did not wear a strimal. I know this is superficial, but I'm not coming from that place. I'm coming from a place of knowing that the Rebbe...
There is a lot of speculation about it, or at least some speculation about it.
He never said explicitly.
I don't think the Rebbe ever spoke about it explicitly. But just from a historical perspective, I think there's this kind of misnomer about Hasidic dress, that all Hasidim always wore the Hasidic dress that you'll see today in Borough Park or Williamsburg. That's not really the case. And the truth is, if you went to Lita before the war, you would see Rabbanim who were not Hasidic wearing Shreimelach. And to someone today, they would look like Hasidim. They wore Shreimelach on long coats, something like a bekisha. So that's number one. Number two is, in Chabad specifically, there was a historic discussion about, in the 19th century, which Glenn Diner has written about, in terms of the Russian authorities enforcing non-Chassidic dress or non-Jewish dress. And a lot of Chassidic rabbis, including the Ger Rebbe and the Tzemach Tzedek, were lenient, right? So it wasn't such, in Chabad, dress was never seen as a fundamental. And I believe that I saw also in Glenn Diner's book, in his most recent book, if I'm remembering correctly, a description of one of the Chabad shtibelach, or maybe the Rebbe's shtibel, as it was in Poland in the 1930s, because the Rayats, you mentioned before, who did wear a shtreimel sometimes. He didn't always, and during the week he suddenly didn't wear a shtreimel. He wore a shtreimel on special occasions, on Shabbos, and there were periods that he didn't wear a shtreimel, actually, even on Shabbos. He started wearing a shtreimel again in honor of the Rebbe's wedding, which is an interesting point. And there's a letter from one of his very close Chassidim, Eliyahu Chaim Altois, where he is writing excitedly to the other Chassidim that since the wedding of the Rebbe, that is the seventh Rebbe, the Rebbe Rayatz has been wearing his shtreimel every Shabbos. So this was like a new exciting development, right? So Glenn Diner has this description of the Frierdiker Rebbe shtibel, the Rayatz shtibel, I believe, in Warsaw, or maybe in Advaz, near Warsaw, and he says that the Chabad Chassidim don't wear Chassidic dress. You know, the person who's describing this, it's a memoir describing, I think, various courts, and Chassidim, people dressed in modern Western European dress. So this wasn't just something, so I think that's something about Chabad in general, and about the way things have developed today in the 20th century, 21st century. Dress has become much more important, I think, than it was actually, even in the 1930s, and certainly in the 19th century. It's become much more associated with Hasidism than it was in that time. And
Interesting.
Certainly in the case of Chabad, that's yeah.
I always understood it as part of, again, the way you articulated it was so beautiful, but the Rebbe almost translating the experience of Hasidus, and both translating the distinctiveness of Hasidus into the American context. That's how how I understood it.
To add one more thing, I think that in some ways Hasidic dress has become a way of kind of self-ghettoizing.
Yes.
A way of becoming more parochial, right? A way of saying we want to preserve the past and not interact with the surroundings around us, not be relevant actually to the world around us. And that is obviously something that was totally in contrast to the Rebbe's whole approach, which was to be, as it were, a universal Rebbe, a universal teacher. He wanted to share Torah and mitzvahs with the world. And so he didn't want to self-ghettoize. He wanted to do the opposite.
So let me ask you, let me bring in, I don't want to spend the entire time, though, I could, speculating about the dress of the Rebbe. And I want to talk about some of the other differences that the Rebbe brought specifically, to America. And one thing that I noticed that I've always found very fascinating is the difference in the approach to specifically outreach that Chabad has, as opposed to there are many outreach institutions, and they all exploded in the 1960s. The Rebbe was doing it even before, and I know for many that they have always couched outreach in Torah learning, in learning Torah and the centrality of Torah. I would never say or ascribe that the Torah and Torah learning is not central in Chabad. That would be an absurd claim and an ignorant claim, because it is, there's probably no Hasidus that has produced more Torah in terms of pages. Yet, when the Rebbe kind of translated Hasidus and into the world of outreach, he emphasized very much mitzvos and the performance of good deeds, do more good deeds. Why is it that the Rebbe centered the performance specifically of mitzvos rather than, let's call it another model, let's call it the Lakewood model, which is setting up kolalim, which could transform a community. Setting up, I don't know, the Chabad certainly has set up yeshivas, but at the heart of like the storefront of Chabad in people's minds is always going to be tefillin, Shabbos candles, tzedakah, homes having a tzedakah box, I know was very important. There's a long history to that. Why is that? Unless I'm misreading it, but it seemed like the Rebbe was deliberately emphasizing the performance of mitzvos rather than Torah learning. Why do you think that was so? And did the Rebbe ever address that specifically?
Well, first of all, it is a misunderstanding, because one of the 10 mitzvahs, I think one of the first, was Mitzvah Torah.
Right? Just so explain to our listeners what a mitzvah is. I know it's a word that's frequently used in Chabad.
A mitzvah is literally its campaigns. And these were the kind of flagship campaigns that the Rebbe called for, not all at once, over a progression of several years. Tefillin is the famous one. Shabbos candles is another one of the famous ones. And it came to be 10 mitzvahim, and including Mitzvah Torah, which is Torah study. So Torah was always, I think from the very beginning, part of his campaign, sharing Torah. Early on, even before the Nasias, he had campaigns for Mishnayos study. Mishnayos Baal Peh was something that, prior to his leadership, when he under the Rayats, he instituted and encouraged that groups should gather to study Mishnah and specifically to actually recite Mishnayos in the streets, right? To purify the air, as it were, to bring Torah into the streets. So that's number one. Number two is that the Rebbe's primary mode of communication was Torah. So, the Rebbe spoke for hours, and when he spoke, almost everything he said was firstly phrased using aphorisms or terms from Psukim and Mamorei Chazal, Mamorei Azara, and secondly, and even more so, explaining them. Right? So his speech is like always Torah commentary.
Absolutely.
There's a lot that he said about why he chose these particular mitzvahs. I want to first say something that he said about the word mitzvah as a general concept, which is, I think, a very beautiful idea, which is not so well known even in Chabad. But this was in 1974, in the summer of 1974, when people were making, let's say, protesting or, asking these kinds of questions. Why does the Rebbe focus on these?
Yeah, we'll get to more of that.
And why use this term? So he said mitzvah is from the word betza, which means profit or gain. And when you have a mem as a prefix to a word, that means that you're doing it for others. So mitzvah means to bring gain to others, to bring purpose to others. He used the word tachlis, to bring meaning, to bring something additional into the lives of others, to share gain with other people. So that's the general idea of these campaigns. Is about sharing the richness of Jewish life and Jewish learning. If you want to think more kind of sociologically, this is less about what the Rebbe himself said, because he did, every time he introduced a new campaign, he would speak extensively about it from a Torah perspective, from talking about it in its halachic terms, its midrashic significance, its Chassidic meaning. Books have actually already been filled just with anthologies of the Rebbe's talks about the 10 Mitzvahim. But from a more kind of sociological perspective, I think that what he really wanted to do, and what's really central to the Rebbe's Torah, and as he himself said so many times, just, if you listen to the Rebbe speak, you'll hear these phrases over again. Torah's Chaim. Torah is the Torah of life. Torah is Milashon Hara. Torah is from the language of teaching, which teaching means pedagogy, is instructive. It tells you what to do. And there's an older idea in Chabad thought, you can find it in the Alter Rebbe many times, that the Torah itself is all about telling you what the mitzvahs are. So the Torah itself kind of indicates that its own goal is to get you to act, is to get you to live differently. So I think many of the mitzvahs that he chose to be Musaim, to be central campaigns, are the kinds of things that can reshape people's lives. They are things that, for example, he has mitzvah bias males farim, which is something I know very close to your heart, the mitzvah to have a house full of books. So that seems like, oh, you're not studying the books, you're filling your house with books. But if you have a house full of books, your life is going to look differently. You're going to take those books off your shelf. It's a way of actually reshaping the environment, the way a person lives. On the most basic level, on the level of the home, on the level of home life, it's not like you go to a special place, a study hall, and once a week you do some studying. This is part of your life. And obviously, tefillin is also that kind of thing. It's a daily mitzvah. Candle lighting is a weekly mitzvah. And candle lighting, Shabbos candle lighting, is also the kind of thing that orients your week around Shabbos is coming. And so it might just start with lighting Shabbos candles, which in itself is a very tremendously valuable thing. But because this is the anchor of your week, well, then Shabbos it's on your calendar now. So now Shabbos is also something that will probably become more a part of your life. And so you're restructuring your life in this kind of way. You know, another mitzvah which he had was the mitzvah of Taras HaMishpacha, which was about women going to mikveh, which again, this is about family life. This is about the patterns of life. I think often the idea of Messiah to outsiders is seen as this kind of, you meet someone in the street and you get to do a one-time event, a one-time mitzvah, which there is a truth to that. There's a huge element, there's a huge belief in Chabad theology about the infinite and eternal power of every single mitzvah. So in that moment, there is nothing else and nothing more is needed, as it were, right? This is an eternal moment of connection, which is never going to go away. But at the same time, there's another aspect to it, which is, I think, this kind of pattern building of a way of Torah becoming a Torah of life. Ultimately, I think that this idea of mitzvahs as important is an expression of the Rebbe's understanding of Torah itself. You know, if we think of Torah as in a more compartmentalized kind of way, then Torah is a kind of
a discipline, yeah.
Precisely. But if we think of Torah as Torah itself thinks of itself, it's a Torah of life. It's instructive. Torah is telling you how to live, how to act. Again, going back to the Alter Rebbe, and this is something the Rebbe many times repeated, but the Alter Rebbe already has this in Torah and Torah many times. The Talmud has the famous debate: is Talmud Gadol or is Ma'aseh Gadol?
What's
the conclusion
better?
Is
well, just explain what you mean by that.
What's greater, is study greater or is action greater? And the conclusion is that Talmud is Gadol Shemeiv L'Dei Ma'aseh. Talmud is greater, study is greater because it brings to action.
Which is circular.
It's circular, but it tells you that the Torah itself always is inclining you, is always sending you towards the realm of action. What are you going to do with this Torah? And I think that's at the heart of the Rebbe's own Torah. The Rebbe actually, he changed the world through teaching. That's the amazing thing. He didn't go out and, I don't know, raise money and do campaigns.
He wasn't on street corners asking people if they were Jewish and putting on tefillin.
Precisely. I think he might have done that once or twice. But yeah, it was through teaching. It was through teaching Torah, and he gave people a Torah worldview that inspired them to help to share it with others, to do Musar, to share gain, to help other people gain more Torah and more mitzvahs.
The thing that I find so remarkable, and I love this idea of the thinking about the way the Torah thinks about itself, and this notion of living differently, which is that the Rebbe seemed to be cultivating an approach to Judaism where mysticism and divinity and transcendence can be hiding in plain sight. Meaning, to me, I kind of understand, and I really saw this when there were all of this like searching because of this outbreak of anti-Semitism that we've been seeing. And there were people who were searching and saying, well, now, obviously, as I've said 101 times and will continue to say, the purpose of Judaism is not to fight anti-Semitism. And you fight anti-Semitism for long enough, and Jews start to ask themselves, so what now? What is the purpose of Judaism? And there was this moment where I was frustrated at the Orthodox community that we were not providing a strong enough answer or even doorway for people to enter. All of world Jewry is going to, I don't know, become Orthodox and move to Boca and Woodmere and Mea Shearim and Beit Shemesh. Like it seemed almost fantastical. Like what could we contribute? I was frustrated. I'm like, why are we not rising and meeting this moment? Which is something that still stays with me, and I'm afraid I don't want this moment to close. But what I heard from so many people is that, you know what Yiddishkeit is to me? It was, and they would say, I go to a Chabad, I go here, I go there. What the Rebbe seemed to be doing was reformulating what common Judaism can be in a post-Holocaust world. We're almost reminding people not that we need to go back and reimagine what our past was, as if everybody in the shtetl was a Chassid in the way that we think of Hasidim now, but reformulating a common baseline Judaism that actually has the potential to address and be an entryway for worldwide Jewry. And when I say common Judaism, I mean it in its academic term. It's something Lawrence Schiffman used that term. Like, what were Jews in the Second Temple period? He said it was common Judaism. Judaism meant a certain thing, kosher, Shabbos. They had a set. Not every Jew. Do you think there is truth to that? Was the Rebbe trying, people don't like the word change, but I like the word translate, a common Judaism that could actually be a doorway for worldwide Jewry?
I think that is definitely part of it, right? That the sense that Judaism is something that's accessible to everyone. It doesn't, denominations don't matter. A mitzvah is a mitzvah no matter what. And that this is the heritage of everyone, that this is not something that we should be keeping for ourselves or for those who we view as legitimate or, those who we view as from enough So there's certainly that aspect of, I think that in the 1940s, 1950s, when the Rebbe first arrived in America, there were those who were kind of defiantly clinging on to their old lives. There were those who had kind of moved into new denominations, Reform, Conservative. And then there were those who were just trying to continue to exist and not really thinking that much about preserving Judaism or passing it on to the next generation. And there weren't even institutions who reaching out to those people or being available for those people. If you were in some hick town in New Jersey, there was no school, So I think there was a very concerted effort on the Rebbe's part. And this started in the period when Rayatz was still the Rebbe. And I think it was part of his vision as well, to create schools for children who are going to public school. I think other Hasidic groups created schools for their own. Whereas I live in Pittsburgh. Achet Mimim of Pittsburgh was founded in those years in the 1940s. And there was no Lubavitcher community here. There was one Chassidic family, one Chabad family. And the Rebbe sent additional shluchim to create a school for the community. So I think there is a great truth to that. He wasn't thinking about the narrow question of Chabad Hasidism or Hasidism in general or from Judaism. He was thinking about the much bigger question of Judaism.
Correct.
In its fullness.
Yes. So, this idea of, and you wrote about this in your book, Social Vision, which, again, I come back to it over and over again, and I credit it for being the first work that really translated the mysticism of the Rebbe's thought into the Chabad that we see and interact with daily. For most people, particularly in the Orthodox community, Chabad is, asking, Jews on the street, men, did you put on tefillin? It's for unaffiliated Jews or for Orthodox Jews on vacation. Like, I didn't really understand how the mysticism connected to all of the social programming that he was doing. But you kind of articulate, I don't know if you use this language, but it was almost a mysticism hiding in plain sight. Like, maybe this is it. Maybe this is to embetter people's lives. And have even material benefit, like to improve their lives and give them the basic necessities to be a Jew and to perform maybe this is it. Maybe this is the deepest form of mysticism, the most sublime.
Mystical connection. Mystical connection comes through connecting with others and helping others, being part of something bigger than yourself. I have to say, by the way, that this is not my book. It's Philip Wexler's book. And this whole way of thinking, the socio-mystical model that he shows, that he saw at the core to be so fundamental to the Rebbe, is something that now that once he started talking to me about it, I saw it everywhere. But the idea is his. Philip Wexler was the one who had the sociological background, the training, that disciplinary prism and perspective to see this and to make that analysis, and I think it's spot on.
Oh, yeah. It's absolutely brilliant because it connects the conceptual with the lived experience, with the phenomenology. What does it feel like to be Jewish? What do people associate Judaism with? And it really connects the end, the end product, the program, the initiative with the beginning, which is the conceptual, which I find extraordinarily remarkable and satisfying. But this notion
and also another point about it is that it shifts the whole idea of what religion is about, because I think generally we have this idea that religion is actually about retreating from other people. Spirituality especially is something that is like an inner thing. For it to be really authentic, you've got to go into a room by yourself and meditate and connect to something beyond yourself and beyond society, outside of society, as it were. And what Philip showed was that this is really a misnomer, and actually the highest spiritual experience happen in a group. When you're together singing niggun. If you're singing a niggun by yourself, it might be a bit hollow. If you're singing a niggun in a group with a bunch of people who share certain aspirations and you feel together, that's a much greater, a fuller, a richer, a more transcendent experience.
Correct.
And that really penetrates so many aspects and is reflecting so many aspects of Hasidic life, Hasidic thought. This idea, it's in chapter 32 of Tanya.
Sure.
It's in so many other places as well.
But I don't even know if I'm using the term correctly, and I know it's a big term that, but the what does it feel like? Phenomenology, like what does it feel like to experience? Really did that. But that brings me to something that we have discussed a great deal, this notion of the most transcendent hiding in plain sight. And to me, and I want to have a fuller discussion about this specifically with you, number one, because I admire your scholarship so much. I also admire your honesty a great deal. Like I have a great sense of trust with you. I don't know why. And the expression that you're giving me right now.
I don't know why either.
I do. I have a real sense of trust with you. And I feel like when you talk to me, as opposed to many others, I was teasing Mati about this. You talk to me, you don't make me feel mibachutz, like an outsider, which is a nice feeling. Even though, I didn't spend my time delving into the Hasidus of Lubavitch all that much. I know a little bit more now, but you've never made me feel like an outsider. In fact, from the very beginning of 1840 even, you've made me feel like I'm rowing with you, like we're doing something very similar. We're rowing together. And that's a very, I'm very grateful for you always approaching me that way.
I think that's true. I think there's something very Chabad about the 1840 project, because I see, my sense of 1840 is also that it is something that is non-parochial, something that is, like you said, you're trying to do common Judaism, to use your term, and play it right back to you.
Yeah.
And yes, so there is an affinity there, no question.
I want to talk a little bit more in depth about the role of moshiach in the Rebbe's thought from the beginning, and what was the Rebbe trying to get people to emphasize or get people to experience or wait for in his notion of Mashiach. And maybe we could begin by starting not with the Rebbe, because it didn't even begin with him. We don't have 20 hours for this, but maybe we could start. There was always an emphasis of Mashiach, both we mentioned from the letter from the founding of Hasidus itself, and the letter of the Baal Shem Tov talks about a confrontation with Mashiach, where, he ascends the supernal worlds. I don't know how you'd even translate it, and has this meeting with Mashiach and says, when are you coming? And Mashiach says, when your wellsprings spill overboard. There was always a messianic component to Chassidic thought and the Chassidic movement, but it seems to have been emphasized in a different way. I don't know when it began in Chabad, but certainly the Rebbe brought it out even more so. But maybe you could begin, we don't have to go all the way back, but maybe you could begin with the notion of Mashiach in Chabad thought before the Rebbe, and then we'll get to the Rebbe.
It's hard to know where to start. Maybe we should go back a little further and say that in Judaism in general, we should acknowledge that Mashiach has always been a fundamental, central part of Jewish aspiration.
I don't want to start there. I don't want to start there. The reason why, and I've said this so many times, Mashiach is the only central tenet of Judaism where, at least outside of Chabad, but I think that's really the only exception, where it is perfectly acceptable to have a second-grade education. Not even a second-grade education. I find it shocking how little people know, or they know nothing about Mashiach. I've asked people all the time, is
the
believing in Mashiach...
Why?
Yeah.
The question is really, why is that the case? Because I think, again, to use a phrase that I used before, earlier on, how does Judaism think about itself? Meaning, if you think holistically about Judaism has a messianic vision at its core. And the whole idea of being in exile, praying 3 times a day for Mashiach, Semach David Avdecha, Mhiris Atzmiach, this is at the core of Judaism, and it has always been at the core. And there have been messianic movements throughout Jewish history. Part of that dynamic is that there's disappointments are suffered. So there are moments in history where, as a result of disappointment, the messianic hope or the emphasis on Mashiach sometimes recedes more into the background. But I think as a general rule, and I think, again, inherently, the way Judaism thinks about itself is that we're on a journey towards universal redemption, towards something where all people in the world will together recognize God.
Well,
and work together in harmony. There'll be no more war. There's this ideal, this hope, and that now, right? The sense is that now we're in a world that is subpar, right? That is not okay. And I think that today, I don't think this is always the case, but I think today, specifically now in the 21st century, I think part of the disinterest in Moshiach has to do with how comfortable Jews have become in America. There's a kind of assimilation, I think, even amongst from Jews, right?
I couldn't agree with you more. Not even just assimilation.
We're so materially comfort. We don't have oppression. The slightest bit of anti-Semitism is like, oh my gosh, right? This is the most terrible thing that's ever happened. Whereas, if you go back 100 years and compare your life to what it was to a Jew in the shtetl, or if you go back to the Middle Ages, how did Rashi experience? What was his kind of relationship? He felt very much, I think all those people, right, who lived through the Crusades or who lived through any other period of Jewish history, they felt that they were in exile in a very raw, direct. It didn't need to be explained to them that there was a need for Mashiach.
Well, I think
we're living in a different kind of era now, where if it's okay to have a second-year-old education about Mashiach, I think that is in part to do with the fact, we're already in Israel. That we checked that box already, and in America things are fine too. So what more is there to look forward to?
Not only
and
that,
I think that also comes from a certain ghettoization, a certain sense of just looking inward and not thinking about that the world around you is still suffering.
Well,
there are other Jews who are not living a full spiritual life. So
I think it's even more than that.
Put the shoe on the other foot.
No, I think it's even more than that. I think it's even more than that. I think people don't just say it's good here. I think Mashiach coming for a lot of people, and they would admit this and maybe even joke around about it, but like it would disrupt the comfort of their lives. I think Mashiach allows us to defer actual belief in the reality of God and the purpose of existence and defer that and say, when Mashiach comes, this will make sense. It's much easier to affiliate with Judaism on a more sociological level, on a cultural level, than to realize the very terror of existence that religion and Yiddishkeit comes to address, the very purpose of existence itself. And when you talk about things like Mashiach in an actual sense, not in a impossible sense. I think people talk about Mashiach as an impossibility. When something seems impossible, they will say, okay, when Mashiach comes, we'll make sense of that. Right. How are Jews doing when Mashiach comes? But it allows you to defer any agency, and Sholem makes a similar argument, but not exactly. But it defers agency in actually imagining or creating a world where Mashiach could be possible, or Mashiach would want to come. And for a lot of people, the way we think about Mashiach, because it's a second grade level of education, it's dreadful for a lot of people. Will I have a nice home when Mashiach comes? How frum will I have to be when Mashiach comes? Am I going to have to get up for davening every morning when Mashiach comes? Right. Am I going to have a good party? I had a
discussion with a group of yeshiva boys a few weeks ago, and they asked me, will there be theme parks when Mashiach comes? This was their big concern. So I said to them that, a person matures through his life, right? When you were 5 years old, you enjoyed playing with Legos. Now you like theme parks. Probably in 10 years' time, there'll be other pleasures, other aspirations that you have, which you find more fulfilling and more thrilling. And that's how it is at every stage in life. People grow. And I think it's the same for society as well. Society is also, I think there's an idea that other philosophers have discussed. I just started reading Thomas Nagel, if I'm pronouncing his name right, one of his recent books on moral philosophy. And he's talking about how each individual goes through the stages that society as a whole has already gone through in their own maturity. But I think this is true, that society does develop, and this is part of the Messianic idea also, in my understanding, that society is developing towards something greater, something better, something more whole, something more moral, something that is better for more people. And that's part that, just like we grow up as individuals, society grows up, society can grow up, and we can kind of get out of, these kind of more immature ideas about what is exciting, what is fun. And maybe by the time Mashiach comes, and when Mashiach comes, you'll be along for the ride. In other words, you and the rest of society will be attuned, will be educated enough to realize what is important, what is exciting, what is valuable in a different way than you do now.
Maybe so, but my question, let me re-articulate the question and see how you answer it this way. The Rebbe's emphasis on Mashiach colored his entire legacy while he was alive and after he passed, since Gimel Tammuz. The number one thing that people think about with the Rebbe, Mashiach. Was he? Wasn't he? Too much emphasis, not enough emphasis. Surely the Rebbe knew that his emphasis on messianism would come at a cost. Surely he knew. Why not take the approach of the yeshiva community of other gedolim and say, okay, when Mashiach comes, he'll come. We'll know. And when he comes, we'll know like everybody else knows. We'll all get the memo at the same time. And in the meantime, let's learn and do whatever we have to do. In yeshivish parlance, one would say, Lamai nafka mina, to keep reminding people to do things to bring Mashiach. Just tell them to do the things. Why do you have to tell them that we're doing it in order to bring Mashiach? If we both are in agreement that more Torah, more divinity, more mitzvos bring Mashiach, then why even tell people that we're doing this in order to bring Mashiach? It reformulated the entire character of the Rebbe and Chabad itself. Why pay such a heavy cost to remind people about the belief in Mashiach? Let it be. They'll say the Yud Gimel Ikarim, that the Rambam includes the 13 principles of faith. You'll remind them, say it once a day after davening. Why make a whole thing about it? He must have known it was going to come at a cost.
I think that
and what was the theological purpose?
I think it has to do with the Rebbe's holistic view of Torah and of Judaism, which is to say that he didn't see Mashiach as something in the future, as like one part of the Torah. The Nevi'im, they talk about Mashiach. For him, every aspect of Torah and every aspect of Judaism is interlinked. And Mashiach isn't just interlinked with every other part, it's the point, it's the purpose of the whole of Judaism. Right? So, I mean, it sounds kind of crazy in a way to suggest that you could go about achieving a goal while ignoring what the goal is. Right? I mean, that itself just kind of sounds like a preposterous kind of proposition. But just to take the thought further, you spoke before of the way people see Mashiach as a way of deferring having to deal with existential issues with God.
Yes.
Right? With having God in your life. Having God in your life is a scary thing.
Yes.
But if you could say, when Mashiach comes, then we'll understand God. Then we can have a relationship with God. That's undoing the whole purpose of Judaism in itself. If you understand a mitzvah as a way of connecting to God, if Hasidus came to build, like I said before, to build a relationship between God and humanity, between God and the world, then to relegate that and defer that to Mashiach is to actually empty Torah mitzvahs of its meaning in the present, right? So it's not just like, Mashiach isn't like the magical result of performing particular actions and learning certain obscure sugyas in the Talmud, right? The Rebbe sees the entirety of Torah, all the mitzvahs that a person does, as a way of actually building, instantiating redemption in the present as well, right? You're creating, you're turning the world bit by bit, experience by experience. You spoke before about the phenomenology, the feeling. What does it mean to live as a Jew? The Rebbe wanted that people should live as a Jew in connection, in a relationship with God, right? That itself can be seen as a kind of messianic ideal, a messianic aspiration. And the Rebbe's whole point in emphasizing Mashiach is that he wasn't deferring Mashiach. He was trying to bring Mashiach into people's lives. He was trying to bring God into people's lives, right? He was trying to infuse the culture, the rituals, the things that we study with their ultimate meaning. He was trying to share that ultimate meaning with all people, bring it to the fore of people's consciousness. And you ask about, surely he knew that people would be opposed to this. I'm not sure that he really did consider that. I think that...
But he must have known in his lifetime...
Because the Rebbe had such an integrated, holistic view of Torah, I don't think it could have been any other way for him. I mean, part of it also has to do, if you want to speak more historically, Chabad Hasidism has put Mashiach at the center of its theology from the outset, right? So if you go to Tanya, when he talks about the ultimate purpose of Torah and mitzvahs, chapter 36, he says that the mitzvahs are ways or tools, as it were, to bring the infinite revelation of God into the world. And when will we ultimately see that revelation in the Messianic era? But the way that we draw that revelation into the world, the way that we permeate the world with Messianic revelation is through our mitzvahs now in the time of exile. The time of exile is a Messianic time, right?
Did the Rebbe ever respond to his critics?
That's a good question. I'm not so aware of the Rebbe directly responding to critics about the Mashiach issue specifically.
And he has one set of letters.
There may have been some occasions when he did, but I can't think of the specifics now.
Let me ask you this, and you had mentioned his name already once, and I know that you're familiar with the book because in a lecture on YouTube, your voice is clearly discernible in the audience, but there was a book written by Elliot Wolfson about the Rebbe's approach to Messianism. Now, Elliot Wolfson is deeply involved in Kabbalistic literature. He's an academic. I don't want to just call him an academic because I think he takes Kabbalah quite seriously. But I don't know that it always coheres or aligns with maybe a traditional approach to mystical thought. And he has a very radical thesis about the Rebbe's approach to Mashiach, and it almost gives it away in the title, which is Open Secret. That's the title of the book, which is, so to speak, that Mashiach is already here and fully attainable. And almost the moment that you realize that you don't need to wait for anything, that is the revelation of Mashiach itself. It is very focused on the present. And it's a very radical thesis. It's quite wild. And I could hear a few reasons why somebody would criticize it, because it seems to minimize the more classical signs of Mashiach, which would be the rebuilding of the third temple and the reintroduction of sacrifices and all the things that we associate based on our second grade level education with Mashiach. And it's very radical in its simplicity. It's here if you can access it, if you can really bring that level of divinity in your life. Do you think Elliot Wolfson understood the Rebbe's approach? Do you think that he missed certain approaches of the Rebbe? What do you think? And I know that you've been engaged in that book. What did you think about his thesis in the book Open Secret?
Well, the first thing to say is that Elliot is an extremely sophisticated thinker and also an extremely knowledgeable scholar. He really, as much as anybody else that I know, he has read the literature, and he himself actually stood at Farbrengens in his teenage years. He actually writes an introduction to Open Secret about one of those encounters and about how, I think it was Yutis Kislev, or at least he mentions that a Chassid at the Rebbe's Farbrengen pointed out to him that his own birthday, that is Elliot's own birthday, is on the eve of Yutis Kislev. Right, so he expresses that kind of autobiographical connection.
Yeah, it's deeply personal. You can tell about it in the book.
It is absolutely. I think all his scholarship is deeply personal. He's a very, very engaged scholar. He cares deeply about the Torah that he's learning and the philosophy that he's reading. So when it comes to the question of Mashiach, his interpretation is also related in general to his own very unique way of thinking about time itself. He has this term, the time swerve.
Yeah.
And which is very embedded and very rooted in Kabbalistic thought and Chassidic thought. We have this kind of axiomatic or intuitive way of thinking about time, which is that it's linear, that the past precedes the present and the future follows after the present. And part of Eliot's whole way of thinking is that actually all these things are kind of embedded within each other, and that there's a circularity to time, that the present actually absorbs the future in certain ways and can even project the future back onto the past. He thinks about this as a reality, not as kind of some kind of...
It's not an abstraction.
It's not an abstraction. It's part of how time itself, time as a real dimension of existence works. that has to do with his thinking about Mashiach as well, that Mashiach is not just in the future. It's something that is already in the present in certain ways. It's accessible. And I think in that he's right. I already made a similar point earlier about how the Rebbe was doing the opposite of deferring the Messianic and the divine to the Messianic era, and was trying to bring it to the fore of people's consciousness in the present. As far as will there be a third temple? Is there a historical Mashiach? So some readers of Eliot's book have come to the conclusion that Eliot understood the Rebbe to be saying that that would not happen. I think that's a very big stretch, and I don't think Eliot himself would agree with that reading of his own book. In fact, on that very occasion that you mentioned earlier, where he gave a lecture and I was in the audience and I asked a question at the end.
I think this was the question you asked.
Well, there's a question that I asked, but here I'm referring to a question that somebody else asked. I asked a question related to this too, but there's another question that was asked specifically about building the third temple. And is this going to be a reality? And as I recall it, what Wolfson said was, and this is of a piece with his other theorizations, his way of understanding metaphor and Kabbalah in general, and especially in Chabad, that everything is absolutely metaphorical and also absolutely literal at the same time. So the Rebbe certainly explicitly insisted on the Rambam as the only halachic codification, the only halachic authority who told us anything about what Mashiach will be like. And the Rambam is quite clear that there will be a king who will communicate and encourage or actually persuade all the Jewish people to observe Torah and mitzvahs, and that he'll wage the wars of God, and that he'll build the third temple in its place, and so on, right? So there are certain clear halachic criteria, which if they do not happen, Mashiach hasn't come, right? So in thinking about the whole idea of Mashiach in the Rebbe's thought, I think it's very important to kind of distinguish between two kind of categories of thought. There's the phenomenological dimension, the spiritual dimension, the experience of Mashiach, and there's the concrete actualization of the Messianic era, the halachic criteria, the fulfillment of the halachic criteria for the coming of Mashiach. And while the phenomenology of Mashiach, I think the Rebbe would say absolutely is accessible now, and in every mitzvah that you do, you can be in touch with the messianic meaning, with the messianic significance of that mitzvah. That needs to be separated from the universal, historical, messianic era, which only happens when the Rambam's criteria have been fulfilled, right? So, when you think about the third temple has tremendous significance, mystical significance, spiritual significance, symbolism. You can study the laws. You can study on a level of pure halacha, how the kabbalas are supposed to function. You can get into all the nitty-gritty details. And you can also get into what the kabbalas mean on a mystical level. And Chassidus has a huge amount to say, actually, about the spiritual work of self-sacrifice, of mikem adam mikem ki yakriv, that a person who wants to come close to God, carbon is from the language of closeness, to come close to God, to establish a relationship with God, it has to come from yourself. The sacrifice, the coming close, has to come from the person's own effort, from his own turning towards God. And, there's tremendous mystical significance in all of that. And that's all accessible in the present. But then there's something shared, something which is not just about you and your personal endeavors or even the community around you. It's something about a historical event, a historical purpose. that the world will come to this
collective realization.
Ultimate realization, exactly. And in that too, there is this time swerve element, because I think, and there's another facet of Eliot's reading of the Rebbe, but also just a plain reading of the Rebbe, that the Messianic perspective will illuminate the past as well. So it's not just that the Messiah arrives and then we can forget the past. The Messianic era is the result of our activity in the past. And so once the Messianic era arrives, we'll be able to look back and see, this is how we got here. We got here because we did X, Y, Z in during the time of exile. And that goes back to the Alter Rebbe's language as well, that the revelation, the Messianic revelation, is the result of Maseinu v'Avodaseinu kol zman meshech hagalos, of our work, our actions throughout the duration of the exile. So exile and redemption can't be separated neatly into two different boxes, as it were. They are two different eras, but they're interlinked. The future informs the past, and we can live in the present in a way that is aware of its ultimate meaning.
I get time swerve because, especially on an individual level, people have a very easy time understanding how childhood and your past still bears upon the present. But even your future, when you look back, because we don't know the future yet, but when you kind of reflect back at your life, there is a narrative where it seems that the future was already drawing you into a certain place. So it does make a great deal of sense for you. But I want to ask you this, and I apologize. I think I asked you this once, a late night via, text or a direct message or something on social media. Can you articulate? I want to give you three possibilities, and you can choose to answer any way you want. When you think about Mashiach, when you think about the coming of Mashiach, what do you have in mind? I'll give you three choices. And I posed the same question to Rav Y.Y. Jacobson, but we already had the recorders turned off. But maybe I'll tell you what he answered afterwards. But let's hear what you say. Do you think, choice number one, do you think of the Rebbe? Choice number two, do you think about it disembodied from any individual and just an era and a consciousness, Mashiach consciousness? Or three, do you think it's some third unknown that we do not know?
So I certainly don't have any individual in mind when I think of Mashiach. I don't know
even
who
the Rebbe?
Mashiach will be. No. That's my personal...
Really?
I don't think there's any obligation for a Chabad Chassid to think that it's the Rebbe, and I personally don't have the Rebbe's face, the Rebbe's avatar in the place of Mashiach in my mind.
Wow.
To me, it's an open-ended thing.
I'm shocked by that.
It's an... Okay.
I think I have the Rebbe in mind. Halfway. No, it's almost unimaginable.
You're more of a Chabadnik than I am.
So for you, you're answering, for you, it's much more of an era and consciousness that you associate with it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I do believe that there will be some figure, some person, right? That's, again, the Rambam, a king, right? Some kind of political figure, a leader, somebody who's powerful, who's persuasive. Maybe it's a political figure, I mean, I don't know exactly how it's all going to work. The Rambam himself says in chapter 12, that the details are open. And he says, I think the language is, you just have to believe in klolos hadavar, the general thing. So I'm actually very comfortable with open-ended questions. That's just something you should know about me. And the Rebbe, I think, too, in certain ways, especially in some of his later talks, it's very fascinating discussions he has about how to reconcile uncertainties and dogmas. And he's creating various Kabbalistic models to allow for a kind of open-endedness, that you don't need to necessarily answer the question. You can have multiple possible truths, which may be mutually exclusive, and yet you can kind of look at them together as part of a single whole, as part of the infinite permutations of Torah interpretation, right? I mean, if you just go back to like Shammai and Hillel, Elo ve'elo divrei Elokim chayim, that's a kind of very basic idea of... These
are the words of God,
These and these are the words of the living God, even though they're mutually exclusive, but they're both true, right? So that's a very kind of basic example of this. But the Rebbe actually thought about this a great deal. And especially having studied those particular talks of the Rebbe, that kind of makes me all the more comfortable with saying, I don't know exactly how it's going to look. But that doesn't empty it of meaning, because it's not about any individual. And maybe for me it's different because I grew up mostly after the Rebbe had already passed away. So I didn't have that strong, emotional attachment in the kind of way that somebody who was in 770 and had pinned their hopes entirely on the Rebbe specifically in that kind of way. So maybe it's different for me. And I sympathize with people who have different experiences than I do. But for me, it doesn't seem like a fundamental. What seems much more fundamental is the whole ethos that the Rebbe brought to Judaism, to living every day with Mashiach, right? To living every day with this kind of urgency, with this kind of sense of ultimate meaning, that what you're doing when you're holding a lulav and esrog in your hands, or when you're giving a coin to tzedakah, you're participating in the cosmic redemption of the world. It's one little piece, and therefore a piece of the infinite, which we know philosophically, a piece of the infinite is infinite, right? So I think that's really what's most important, is living with that feeling with that sense, with that consciousness, that the mitzvahs that you do have ultimate meaning, and that they are contributing to the redemption of the entire world.
No, I like it. And you said something, when you were talking before about Mashiach, and I reflected on some of the things that I felt very lacking kind of in the Orthodox community now, and even more so, I think, even in the non-Orthodox community, is Mashiach as providing a historical consciousness to the Jewish people of saying we're on a journey towards something, and not looking at the snapshot of whatever the Yiddishkeit looks like and feels like in, July of 2024. This is the way it always has been and always will be, but understanding and appreciating we are moving towards something, and each generation has contributed and is moving us closer towards something. And I find a lot of that historical consciousness, even of the development of Judaism itself and what is essential and what is non-essential, is troubling for a lot of people, especially Americans, because it's a lot of good vibes here. It's good vibes. You don't like thinking necessarily about a future that is radically different than this. And even a past. It's much easier to superimpose the present onto the past than really think about an actual past. And I've always felt that was different in Chabad. But let me ask you this, because, it's so interesting. You're kind of unique. I don't know if you're wholly unique in this, but you're unique, and definitely among the Chabad Hasidim that I've spoken to, is your command of general secular philosophy and your engagement with philosophy outside of not just Chabad, but outside of Judaism. It really is remarkable. So I'm curious, specifically this is outside of Chabad, but it's a critic, certainly not outside of Judaism. I'm curious what you make of David Berger's book. David Berger in the 90s came out with a book about Chabad, Lubavitch, and the scandal of Orthodox indifference. And he begins the book by saying, this is a lament. Am I watching the beginning of Christianity? It was soon after the Rebbe died. There was a great deal of trauma, both within and outside of Chabad. I felt a little bit of it. My assistant principal, Rabbi Newman, was Lubavitch. How do you, Eli Rubin, I'm not asking you to speak on behalf of, Worldwide International Chabad, but how do you, Eli Rubin, think about that book? Do you think he got anything right? Do you think he got a lot of things wrong? How do you approach that clarion call that basically said, we got to wake up and make sure this doesn't metastasize into a separate religion? He obviously got his start with, the beginning, early Christianity. That's his focus and scholarship. How do you look at that book?
Well, as you said, it was published back in the 1990s when I was still very young. So I certainly can't claim to have read it recently. And I don't even know if I read it at the time. I remember when it came out, and I remember the scandal. I remember I grew up in London, and Rabbi Chaim Rapport wrote a response.
Sure, I have it.
So I remember that happening, and I remember I probably saw Rabbi Rapport's response before I saw David Berger's original. So it's difficult for me to, comment with any kind of specificity. But I think that just generally speaking, if we look at Chabad today and we look at Chabad's relationship with the rest of the Orthodox world, I think things are pretty good. And I don't think there's a sense that Chabad is like some other kind of cult or breakaway from Judaism. I think that if there was a feeling of a split or a forthcoming split, I think that has largely receded and kind of been forgotten. That's my sense.
Let me kind of wind down. I've had you for a very long time, and I'm very appreciative of it. The Rebbe passed away 30 years ago, and Chabad has gotten even larger and stronger in many ways. What do you think the secrets of the way his memory has been preserved that allow for such incredible posthumous growth? Do you think the Rebbe was deliberately preparing for the movement's flourishing after this? The Rebbe obviously knew he did not have any children. He never appointed a successor. Does Chabad look at themselves as like the Rebbe planned for all this? He saw this coming.
I can't speak for Chabad in general, but I can tell you what I think.
Yeah, what do you think?
That is that from the very outset of the Rebbe's leadership, he actually spoke and acted as if there was no leader of Chabad alive. He spoke and acted as if the Rebbe Rayatz was the Rebbe. And he wrote so much, especially in the first years after Rayatz passed away, about the way a Rebbe's leadership continues after he's departed from a physical body. He wrote about, citing obviously Tanya, there's a very famous letter in the back of the Tanya, Igeres Chav Zayin, letter number 27, with an additional beer elaborating on it, also by the Alter Rebbe, which talks about how a tzaddik in his lifetime has to mediate everything he communicates through the body. And so the soul is, as it were, imprisoned in a body. And the way his students can access that soul is only insofar as the tzaddik speaks and articulates, allows a kind of superficial, externalized radiance of his soul to extend into the space around him. So if you're not present with the tzaddik, you can't really access the tzaddik. If you can't hear the tzaddik, you can't really access the tzaddik. But then after the tzaddik passed away, actually what's happened is that the soul is no longer bound by the body. And so the spiritual life of the tzaddik, what he defines as his love of God, his awe of God, and avosai, yerosai, there's a third one which I'm blanking on, which is terrible.
That's okay.
But his spiritual life becomes accessible as it is, without any superficiality, without any externalization. The soul becomes accessible directly to his disciples. Now, that's a kind of mystical explanation about the soul no longer being bound by a body. But the Rebbe spoke about this in very tangible terms, that now the chief way to access the Rebbe is, and to have a relationship, is not by looking at his face or being in his presence, but it's through studying his Torah, which is his inner life. It's through participating, getting a feeling for how the Rebbe felt. What was the Rebbe's position, as it were, his relationship with God? Through his Torah, you can participate in something of that in a very direct, more integrated way, in a way that is more your own inner worship than it could ever have been during the time of the tzaddik's life. So my point here is that I don't want to delve too much on all the details, but the Rebbe spoke about this a lot, tremendous amount in the 1950s. And so today, it's very easy for someone like me to go back and read this and apply it all to the Rebbe. There's no one who spoke as much about how to relate to a tzaddik who's no longer alive as the Rebbe himself. And he wrote about it and he spoke about it. And I'll just finish off with one especially striking thing, which I wrote about recently. He actually translates the word histalkos, which means departure.
Normally it just signifies like somebody passing away.
Passing away, right? So this is the traditional Chassidic euphemism.
Yeah, for
a tzaddik passing. And it comes from, the word histalkos is actually in today's Chumash, I noticed, in Rashi. So it's a rabbinic phrase, it's a rabbinic term, which is used in Kabbalah a lot, specifically with regard to Tzimtzum, which, as you know, is one of my favorite topics.
Yes.
Right? So God withdrawing from the world, departing from the space of the cosmos is signified by the term histalkos. And in one of the very first publications that the Rebbe issued after the Rayatz passed away, he said that just like in Chabad, I'm paraphrasing here, but the gist of it is, just like in Chabad, we understand Tzimtzum in a non-literal way. That is to say, that God never actually departs, but rather God is fundamentally present. So histalkos, the term histalkos as departure, also needs to be interpreted in a non-literal way. And he referred to the Rayatz's own discourse, which he had published in advance of the day on which he passed away, to be studied on the day that he passed away. Where
when he passed away, meaning his father-in-law, or when the Rebbe himself passed away?
No, when Rayatz passed away.
Okay.
Before Rayatz passed away on the 10th of Shvat.
Yeah.
Which is the anniversary, it's the yahrzeit of his grandmother. So he had issued a publication, a published mimer, a discourse, to be studied on the occasion of his grandmother's yahrzeit, which turned out to be the day of his own passing. And in that discourse, he talks about the Zoharic phrase, which means when the other side, which means the profane, the unholy side, is subdued, estalig, that's the same word as histalkos, Yukara the Kuchibricho, the glory of God, ascends in all the worlds. Right? So there, histalkos means an ascent. But the Rayatz in his discourse explained that this is actually a downflow of divine ascendance. Right? So he reinterpreted the word histalkos, to mean a downflow of divine ascendance. And then, a few weeks later, the Rebbe, his son-in-law and successor, pointed to this interpretation of the word histalkos and said, if you want to understand what the passing of a tzaddik means, this is what it means. It means a downflow of ascending revelation, of an exalted revelation. So it means that the Rebbe is more present. And I think that for earlier Rebbes, this might have been a kind of mystical precept, like I said before, something you had to believe in. But I think when it comes to the Rebbe, his presence is tangibly more available. His teachings are more available than they ever were in his lifetime. I think if you stood in 770 in the 1980s, you had a very narrow perspective, a narrow glimpse of who the Rebbe was, of what was in his mind, what he was thinking. Obviously, there were people who were very learned and who had more insight and so on. But generally speaking, the kind of access that we have now, the ability to really study the Rebbe's thought on a grand scale and to think really deeply about what he wanted from us and about what we can learn from him. I think in that sense, he is much more accessible now than he ever was, and increasingly so. You know, we have the internet now. We have videos, we have audio, you can listen to Fabrengans. You know, I think there's a massive difference between standing in 770 where you're being pushed and you can't hear so well, and your memory isn't so great, and you're tired. But now you could listen to the same Fabrengan at your dining room table and follow along with the text and pause it if you've got if you get distracted and carry on, right? I think that's a tremendous benefit that we have. And so in that sense, this downflow of the Rebbe's presence, I think, is really, really tangible. And it's not just a mystical idea as it might once have been in early generations.
As we said from the outset, it created a world where that presence and mysticism and transcendence really can be hiding in plain sight. And my dearest friend, Rav Eli, I cannot thank you enough. I always wrap up my interviews with more rapid-fire questions. I know we did this once. Humor me, we'll do it again. I've been asking people, and this is so hard, especially with the Torah of the Rebbe, because there is so much of it. Do you have a good introductory text to the Rebbe's thought? Preferably in English.
I'm very happy to now recommend that everybody read Yosef Bronstein's really amazing tome. It's like 700 pages.
Yes.
And it is the most thorough introduction to date to the Rebbe's Torah teachings.
Wow. That's high praise.
Yeah. Well, I don't think anyone's even tried before. So, it's a very daunting thing to do because the Rebbe spoke for 40 years, and so his teachings are spread out, and they're in different genres, different times. He spoke topically on the Parsha of the week, but to organize it and think about it systematically and to kind of extract and compile and anthologize thematically and take out the key lines of thinking and show how they're linked together, and also to contrast it to earlier Jewish thinkers, to kind of put it in the grand narrative and the grand scale of Jewish thought. What did the Rambam say? What did the Ramban say about key theological issues like Bechira, free will, and what is the Rebbe's contribution to these fundamental theological, philosophical discussions, or to take to demonstrate the way that the Rebbe kind of holistically reads Talmudic, halachic sugyas in light of Kabbalistic or philosophical Chassidic ideas, and to do that in not just kind of in a piecemeal way with like one example or kind of impressionistic way, but to do it really having stepped back and taken a look at something very big, and then not just taking one topic. Like Elliot Wolfson, like you said, did a marvelous job, also daunting in its own way, of kind of really getting into the depths of what the Rebbe meant when he spoke about Mashiach. On, like you said, a phenomenological level, on an experiential level, on a philosophical level. But that's it's a fundamental aspect of the Rebbe's
No, Yosef's work is, And God willing, we will be having him on. My next question, I'm always curious, and specifically for you, you already have a book coming out, but if somebody gave you a great deal of money and allowed you to take a sabbatical and write another book, because you have a book coming out about Tzimtzum, do you have the title that you could share with our listeners?
The title is Kabbalah and the Rupture of Modernity.
I love it. I love the title. Who's publishing it?
It'll be out from Stanford University Press in March. Absolutely. And the subtitle is an existential history of Chabad Hasidism.
I'm so excited for it. If somebody gave you a great deal of money and allowed you to write another book, what do you think the topic of that book would be? What's the next one?
That's a good question. I have a bunch of different ideas. One that I have is actually to write a book on Rayats. I think that would be a very interesting. No one has yet written a study devoted to him specifically, and I'm fascinated by the sixth Rebbe, and he's in many ways very different to the seventh Rebbe, a mystical giant in his own right, but someone with a kind of very vivid and creative mind, a writer, a literary. He was somebody who wrote literary works. See, he was a poet. He was a novelist, I think, in his soul, but he was also a rabbi. And he kind of bridges the old world of the shtetl and the new world of America. He grew up in Lubavitch, spent the first 35 years of his life in the shtetl of Lubavitch, already then, in his young adulthood, he traveled to Vienna. He saw Europe. He saw the big cities of Europe, St. Petersburg and so on. But later he moved to Warsaw and then to New York. So he had that memory. And his grandmother, I mentioned before, whose yahrzeit he shares, was also a repository of memory going back to the second Rebbe of Chabad. And he was very influenced by her. One of his earliest literary works was actually a kind of biography of his grandmother. So I think he is this tremendous, luminous figure who has yet to be properly described and understood and appreciated. So maybe I'll write a book about him one day.
My final question, I'm always curious about people's sleep schedules. What time do you go to sleep at night, and what time do you wake up in the morning? You're always available to me at all hours of the day, so I'm always curious. But what time do you go to sleep at night, and what time do you wake up in the morning?
I would say these days I go to bed probably about 1. Sometimes it's later. Sometimes maybe earlier, but about 1. And I get up when my kids wake me up, which is, 7 o'clock in the morning. Or a bit earlier than that even.
My dearest friend, Rev. Eli Rubin, I am so grateful for your time, for all of your friendship, scholarship, Torah, and kindness that you have given me over all these years. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you. This was really a great conversation. Thank you.
One way where I have seen the fact that Eli is not afraid of big theological questions, and I don't want to get into too much detail on this, but people who have been listening to 1840 for a very long time know that we've kind of stepped in the mud a few times with some of our theological explorations, and maybe we have asked questions that were inappropriate to ask publicly, or may be, I don't want to use the word, but would be perceived as almost heretical, or actually heretical. And we've surfaced things that people are not always comfortable with. And there have been times where I've received very real and thoughtful criticism. I'm not even criticizing the criticism. This is not a discussion that we should be having. And I'm so indebted to Eli Rubin, because even at the worst or most difficult or most kind of confusing controversies that we've been embroiled in since we began in 1840, we're now entering our 5th year. Eli, I remember specifically a specific episode that we actually had to take down and delete. Eli reached out and said, you know what? I understand what you're doing. I understand what this is about. I understand the context and the perspectives that you are trying to transmit. And to me, it was more than just like, oh, it's nice to have, a frum, serious person not think that I'm trying to eradicate or uproot or destroy Judaism. That actually is nice, and it's a nice thing to hear. But more than that, I saw a kindred spirit. I saw somebody who's not afraid of big questions, who's not afraid of really stepping into the depth of the most cosmic questions that we have about life, that we have about the world, that we have about existence. He does not dismiss other approaches. He doesn't have any sense of ego or entitlement that my approach must be correct. What I find so moving about him is that he's deeply committed and deeply moved in a very real way from the Torah and approach of Chabad and the Lubavitcher Rebbe, but it's specifically because he is so committed and so passionate that gives him the confidence to explore, that gives him the confidence to look a little bit outside, to ask those big questions, to see how are other people approaching these questions. And that's why I think Eli Rubin is such a appropriate messenger to convey the depths of the approach of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The point of this series is not to get people to transform into Chabad. It's not even to get people to, it's certainly not to get people to, believe the Rebbe is Moshiach, is not Moshiach. None of this is the point of this series. The point of this series is to introduce a perspective and a person who championed that perspective, namely Rav Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the 7th Lubavitcher Rebbe, who tried to convey to the world a way to make the most cosmic questions apprehendable, to make them accessible, and to create a world and a way of life where we don't have to close our eyes in order to feel the divine, in order to find transcendence, but we can approach the world, whether it's in our social services, whether it's helping another Jew, looking at somebody else, looking at the world, looking at other ideas and philosophies, and do it with a sense of confidence in the realness of God, in the realness of Yiddishkeit and the Jewish people, and to not be insecure in our approach of the world. And that is the gift that I have received from engaging in the world of Chabad and in the perspective specifically of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. That's what this series and this approach, what we're trying to transmit, is all about. To have the confidence and the urgency and the motivation to ask big questions that ultimately we hope that we will see realized in our lifetimes, the ultimate fulfillment of the capital A answers. So thank you so much for listening. This episode was edited by our stand-in, Dina's away. This episode was edited by our friend Rob. If you enjoyed this episode or any of our episodes, please subscribe, rate, review, tell your friends about it. You can also donate at 1840.org/donate. It really helps us reach new listeners and continue putting out great content. You can also leave us a voicemail with feedback or questions that we may play on a future episode. That number is 516-519-3308. Once again, that number is 516-519-3308. Or, of course, you can email us at info@1840.org, 18forty.org, info@1840.org. If you'd like to learn more about this topic or some of the other great ones we've covered in the past, be sure to check out 1840.org. That's the number 18, followed by the word 40, FORTY, 1840.org, where you can find videos, articles, recommended readings, and weekly emails. Thank you so much for listening, and stay curious, my friends.
Show